Jamal Thompson stepped into his car dealership as he had done every day for the past decade, his polished shoes clicking against the gleaming floor, his mind already running through the day's agenda. The hum of the showroom greeted him like an old friend, the soft chatter of salespeople, the buzz of phones ringing, and the ever-present scent of new leather and polished chrome. He had built this place from nothing, a run-down lot on the edge of town, where no one expected much, into a thriving business that was now the largest black-owned dealership in the region. Every corner of the dealership bore the marks of his vision, his relentless ambition, and the sweat of countless late nights and early mornings spent ensuring its success. Jamal had started out as just another young man with a dream, working multiple jobs to pay the bills and save up enough money to buy his first few cars. There were setbacks, of course, people who doubted him, who told him a black man couldn't build something like this. But he had never been one to listen to the doubters. His love for cars, his commitment to excellence, and his unshakable belief in himself had driven him to defy every obstacle that came his way. The dealership had grown exponentially over the years, and Jamal had become not only a businessman but a beacon of possibility for others who had dreams of their own. Yet, today, as he walked into the showroom, something felt different. There was a tension in the air, an unease he couldn't shake. It wasn't the usual buzz of activity that greeted him. There was a strange stillness, a sense that something wasn't quite right. He noticed it immediately: the way the salespeople, usually so eager to greet him, seemed distracted, whispering amongst themselves. His sharp eyes scanned the room, moving over the faces of his staff before finally landing on the young woman sitting at a desk in the corner. She was unfamiliar to him, but it wasn't just her presence that felt off, it was the way she was holding herself. She sat stiffly, a contract clutched in her hands, her face a mask of uncertainty. Jamal's instincts kicked in. He had spent years reading people, understanding their motives, their discomforts, and their strengths. And right now, the woman at the desk was radiating unease. His mind quickly processed the scene: the young woman in her professional attire, the contract in her hands, the way she glanced around as if waiting for someone to acknowledge her. Jamal's gaze hardened. He walked towards her, his presence commanding attention, and when he spoke, his voice was steady but filled with authority. "Can I help you?" he asked, his eyes never leaving hers. The woman looked up, startled by his approach, her nervousness growing more evident. I'm here for the interview," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she pushed the contract forward. "I was told to come in for a final discussion about the position." Jamal's brow furrowed. The position. He had not authorized any hiring recently. In fact, there was no vacancy he knew of. His mind raced as he quickly scanned her appearance again, taking in the details. She looked capable, but something didn't sit right. The dealership had a process: thorough background checks, interviews, and vetting procedures before anyone stepped into the office. It had worked well for years. So why had this woman slipped through the cracks? "Who told you about this interview?" Jamal asked, his tone growing more focused. The woman swallowed hard before responding. "Mr. Brooks, he said he'd get back to me today. That we were just finalizing the details." Jamal's eyes narrowed. Brooks was one of his senior managers, a man he trusted implicitly. Or so he thought. He knew Mr. Brooks had a reputation for being thorough and meticulous, but this didn't add up. Jamal turned on his heel and walked toward the back office, his mind racing. He needed answers, and fast. He called Mr. Brooks into his office, a heavy silence settling over the showroom as his employees followed the subtle shift in energy. When Brooks arrived, his face was a mask of confusion. Jamal, what's going on? There's a young woman sitting at the front desk with a contract, Jamal said, his eyes locked onto Mr. Brooks. She's here for an interview. But I don't remember authorizing any hiring. Care to explain? Mr. Brooks stammered, his usual confidence faltering. I don't know what to say. I was just following up on the applications. She seemed like a good fit. She had all the right qualifications, Jamal cut him off, his patience wearing thin. I don't care about qualifications. I care about how we run this dealership. I trust you to handle the hiring process, but this. He gestured toward the door. This doesn't make sense. There was a long pause as Jamal let the silence fill the space between them. Mr. Brooks looked away, guilt flashing in his eyes. I thought she'd be a good addition, he muttered, but Jamal could see the cracks in his facade. This was more than just a simple mistake. There was something deeper here, something more personal, a decision that had been made behind closed doors. As Jamal took a deep breath, he realized the tension he had felt walking in was not just about the woman or the contract, it was about the trust he had placed in people who were now testing his patience. He would have to face these challenges head-on, not just for the success of his business but for the integrity that had gotten him this far. Hannah sat at the sleek conference table, the weight of the thick, formal contract resting in her hands. She had spent the last few weeks learning the ropes of her new position, her first real job after years of studying, of waiting for this opportunity to prove herself. The room was cool and sterile, the soft hum of the air conditioner the only sound, except for the occasional rustle of papers and the low murmur of voices around her. Everything about the environment screamed professionalism, control, and power. She couldn't help but feel small in comparison, even though she had earned this moment, had fought for it with everything she had. As she glanced down at the contract in her hands, her fingers lingered over the glossy surface, the words on the paper almost dancing in front of her eyes. There was a slight tremble in her hands, not out of fear, but because this was it, this was the moment she had been waiting for. The ink on the page was more than just words to her, it was a sign of everything she had worked for, a promise of what might come next. She didn't realize the weight of the decision before her, didn't know that in those few pages lay the future of her career, her identity, her autonomy. As she flipped through the contract, her mind raced briefly, trying to catch up with the steady pulse in her chest. Each clause seemed to demand her attention, and though she didn't fully understand every legal term, she trusted that she would learn. The feeling of being new, of being in a space where everyone else had more experience, was uncomfortable, but not insurmountable. She would rise to the occasion, as she always had. The nervousness that fluttered in her stomach was the same she had felt before every big moment in her life. But there was a quiet determination, too, a voice inside her that said she was capable, that she belonged in this room, at this table, even if she still wasn't sure of it herself. As her gaze moved across the lines of text, something caught her eye. It was a clause she had glanced over too quickly the first time, buried beneath the formal language and the promises of success. At first, it seemed innocent enough, a small stipulation about compensation and benefits. But then she read it again, and a cold chill ran down her spine. The clause seemed harmless at first glance, but it wasn't. It was a loophole, a trap, something that would leave her vulnerable, without recourse if things went wrong. It wasn't just about the money. It was about control, about the subtle way this company had designed the terms of her employment to tip the scales in their favor. She had seen this before, in the stories of other women, stories that felt distant, almost like fairy tales that didn't apply to her. But now, it was her story. The reality of it hit her in that instant, a wave of disbelief and anger flooding her chest. She blinked, feeling her heart race, but her outward expression remained calm. She didn't know what to do. The decision before her wasn't simple. The contract was a promise, yes, but it was also a silent command, a demand for compliance, for obedience. Hannah's grip tightened on the paper, her fingers digging into the edges as she tried to steady herself. She wanted to speak up, to confront the people across from her, to challenge them, but her voice felt trapped somewhere inside her, tangled with doubt. She had worked so hard to get here. How could she jeopardize it now? Yet, she could not ignore the feeling that this was wrong, that the very foundation of her success might come at the cost of her dignity, her future. She glanced around the table at the faces of the others, men and women who were used to this, used to the power that came with a signature on a page. They were all smiling, polite, their eyes gleaming with the same quiet assurance that she had once worn, but now felt so far from. This moment, small in the grand scheme of things, felt like a pivotal one. She could accept this deal and walk away, grateful for the chance, but fearful of the compromises it would demand. Or she could reject it, unsure of what would come next, but knowing that her integrity was not for sale. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes refocused on the clause. Was this worth it? Was it worth sacrificing her voice, her autonomy, just to climb the ladder of success? The thought gnawed at her. She wasn't sure yet, but deep inside, she knew this wasn't the first test she would face. She had made it this far because she was willing to fight for what she believed in, even when the odds were stacked against her. As she exhaled slowly, she felt the small tremor in her hands subside. She still wasn't sure what to do, but she knew one thing for certain: she was not a pawn in anyone's game. She didn't know what the next step would be, but whatever it was, she would walk through it with her head held high, because she had something the contract could never take from her: her strength, her belief in herself, and her quiet resolve to face whatever came next with grace. The CEO strode into the conference room with the confident air of someone accustomed to command, his tailored suit sharp and perfectly pressed, the weight of his authority almost palpable in every movement. He had just come from a series of successful meetings, each more lucrative than the last, and was feeling the familiar rush of power that came with closing major deals. But as his eyes fell upon the contract laid out before him, that confidence quickly began to falter, his gaze narrowing in disbelief. The words on the paper were incongruent with everything he had expected, everything he had been told. He could feel his chest tightening, his pulse quickening as a wave of frustration rose within him. What is this? His voice was calm at first, but it quickly cracked with rising anger as he pointed at the document, as if the paper itself were to blame for the betrayal he felt. Explain to me how this happens. His words were clipped, harsh, his control slipping with every second as he struggled to comprehend what was happening. Across the table, the young woman sat frozen, her hands trembling slightly as she looked down at the contract in front of her. She hadn't anticipated this, hadn't imagined that the document, a simple miscommunication, could send the room spiraling into chaos. She could feel the heat of his stare, the weight of his anger pressing down on her. Her throat tightened, and for a moment, she found herself at a loss for words. Fear swirled in her chest, mingling with confusion. She had worked so hard to get here, to prove herself, and now it felt as though everything was slipping through her fingers. She had never seen him like this, never imagined that the CEO, so poised and composed in all the meetings, could be so rattled by a single mistake. But the pressure was on, and she knew she couldn't afford to back down, not now. I think there's been a mistake, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper, her heart pounding in her ears. She wasn't sure how to explain it, how to make him understand that this was a simple error, something that could easily be fixed. But the look on his face, the anger, the disbelief was like a wall that kept her from finding the right words. She had always prided herself on being calm under pressure, on thinking on her feet, but this was different. This wasn't just any mistake. This was a mistake that could cost them everything, that could undo all the hard work she had put into securing this deal. As her eyes flickered nervously from the paper to his face, she could see his anger growing, the sharp lines of his jaw tightening with every passing second. He wasn't just angry about the contract. He was angry about feeling vulnerable, about having his trust shattered. And as much as she wanted to explain, to apologize, to assure him that it was a simple misunderstanding, she couldn't help but feel the weight of his betrayal settling heavily in the room. A mistake. The CEO's voice rose in disbelief, a bitter laugh escaping him as he shook his head, his fingers gripping the contract with white knuckles. This isn't a mistake. This is a failure. A failure to catch something so basic. His tone had shifted, no longer calm and measured but raw with frustration, disappointment, and a deep sense of betrayal. His eyes burned with a fire she had never seen before, and she realized in that moment that he wasn't just upset with the error itself. He was upset because this error represented something deeper, something he had worked hard to build, something he couldn't afford to lose. And in his mind, her failure was a reflection of his own failure to maintain control, to prevent something so simple from derailing the entire operation. The room was heavy with the weight of his anger, but Maya didn't shrink back. She took a deep breath, feeling the familiar tremor of fear mixed with the steel of determination. She wasn't going to cower. She had come this far, and no matter how badly she wanted to make this right, she refused to let the CEO's anger define her worth. She met his gaze, her own eyes steady, and said in a voice that carried more conviction than she felt, "I will fix it. I promise." The words felt hollow in the moment, but she spoke them with certainty, as if they could somehow make everything okay again. It wasn't the answer he wanted to hear, but she knew it was the only one she could offer. The CEO's breathing was shallow as he stared at her, the rawness of his emotions hanging between them like an invisible barrier. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, and she could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her, each second stretching longer than the last. Then, with a sharp exhale, he turned his gaze back to the contract, his fingers tapping against the paper in frustration. "I can't believe this is happening," he muttered under his breath, his voice a low growl of disbelief and anger. Maya's chest tightened, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if she could somehow steady herself against the storm of emotions whirling around her. She had failed, and yet she wasn't giving up. She wasn't going to let this one mistake define her, even if the CEO couldn't see that yet. The tension in the room was almost tangible, each passing second thickening the air between the two of them like a storm just before the first crack of thunder. Sarah stood, calm and poised, across from the CEO, a woman who had always been a figure of authority, a leader who exuded power and confidence. But now, as Sarah watched the CEO's hands tighten around the edge of her desk, her face flushed with growing anger, something had shifted. The warmth that had once been an underlying comfort between them, an understanding built on mutual respect and years of collaboration, had dissolved, replaced by a sharp, cutting energy that left Sarah's heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't just a disagreement, this was something more, something deeper. The CEO's voice, once calm and measured, had risen in frustration, accusing Sarah of making decisions without consulting her, of undermining her authority in front of the board. The words felt like punches, each one landing with more force than the last, and Sarah could feel the weight of every accusation pressing down on her shoulders. It was one thing to disagree, to have a difference of opinion. It was another thing entirely to have your integrity questioned, to feel like your character was under attack. Sarah's pulse raced, but she fought the rising panic within her, grounding herself in the calm she had worked so hard to cultivate over the years. Her mind flashed to the countless meetings, the late nights spent poring over reports, the sacrifices she had made to prove herself in a world that hadn't always been kind to her. She had earned her position at this table, earned her place in this company, and she wasn't about to let it slip away because of a misunderstanding. "I never meant to undermine you," Sarah replied, her voice steady, though she could feel the storm inside of her. She wasn't sure if the words were meant to convince the CEO, or if they were meant to convince herself. Her fingers gripped the edge of the conference table, and for a moment, she looked down, collecting herself before meeting the CEO's gaze once more. The woman's eyes were narrow, her jaw set with determination, and Sarah could see that she wasn't backing down. What had started as a simple disagreement now felt like a battlefield, the power dynamic between them shifting in real time. The CEO, once the undeniable authority in the room, now seemed almost smaller, vulnerable in a way Sarah had never seen before. It was as though the mask of control had slipped, exposing the raw frustration beneath it. Sarah felt a flicker of empathy. This wasn't just about the company, about the numbers or the decisions made. This was about ego, pride, and a deep-seated fear of losing control, of being seen as weak. But she wasn't here to pander to that. She was here to explain herself, to defend her integrity, and to show that she could stand her ground. "I've always respected you," Sarah continued, her words slower now, more deliberate. "But I also have to do what I believe is right for the company. We both want the same thing, to see it succeed. That's why I made the decisions I did. I never meant to go behind your back." The CEO didn't respond immediately, her lips pressed tight as she took in Sarah's words. The silence that followed felt like a heavy weight, stretching between them, each second amplifying the tension in the room. Sarah's mind raced, but she kept her focus, watching the CEO for any sign of a shift, any indication that the storm might pass. She could see the inner battle playing out in the CEO's eyes, the conflict between pride and reason, between the need to maintain authority and the recognition that Sarah wasn't just another subordinate, another person to dismiss or silence. The power dynamic had changed. It wasn't just about the job anymore, it was about respect. It was about understanding that each of them, in their own way, had a stake in the company's success and that neither one was more important than the other. The CEO's body language softened slightly, though her frustration still lingered. For the first time, she didn't seem quite as untouchable, quite as sure of herself. Sarah could see it now, the vulnerability in her eyes, the hesitation in her posture. She wasn't just angry anymore, she was scared. The realization hit Sarah like a wave. This was more than just a disagreement over business. It was a battle of wills, a test of who could hold their ground when everything seemed to be slipping away. In that moment, Sarah knew that if she wanted to keep her position, if she wanted to keep the respect she had worked so hard to earn, she would have to fight for it. She couldn't let the CEO's anger undermine her confidence. She had to show her, and herself, that she was capable of navigating this storm. "I didn't act in haste," Sarah said, her voice softer now, yet filled with undeniable strength. "I did what I thought was best for the future of this company. And I still believe that." The room seemed to hold its breath as the CEO stood motionless for a moment, then slowly nodded. It wasn't an apology, but it was something more, an acknowledgement, a shift, a recognition that Sarah was not the person she had assumed her to be. And in that moment, Sarah realized that the true battle wasn't about the decision they had disagreed on, it was about the power to define her own worth, to stand up for what she believed in, even in the face of adversity. The power dynamic had shifted, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah could feel the control slipping from the CEO's hands, right into her own. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to be cut with a knife, as the CEO's voice rose above the murmurs of disbelief from the gathered employees. Behind her, standing just out of sight from the others, a security guard named Peter watched the scene unfold. His eyes flickered between the woman and the CEO, his face a mix of confusion, concern, and unease. Peter had worked at the company for years, long enough to know the power dynamics at play, long enough to recognize that standing up to someone like the CEO, someone with so much influence and control, was not something to be taken lightly. He had seen countless employees quiver in her presence, and most of them would have quietly acquiesced to her demands, accepting whatever words she threw at them without a second thought. But this woman, the one standing in front of the CEO, was different. She wasn't backing down. Her posture was calm, but there was a quiet fury in her eyes that had long been ignored by the corporate world, eyes that had been underestimated, dismissed as not belonging in this environment. The CEO, too, seemed unaccustomed to being challenged. Her hand rested on the desk, the line of her jaw taut with frustration, her usual confident mask slipping just enough for Peter to see the cracks beneath it. She was losing control of the situation, and for the first time, Peter could feel that shift. As the confrontation escalated, Peter's heart raced. He wasn't supposed to get involved, wasn't supposed to let personal feelings cloud his judgment. His job was to maintain order, to ensure that the environment remained calm and productive. But as the tension between the two women mounted, Peter found himself torn. His body swayed slightly, as though caught between two opposing forces. On one side was his role, his duty to uphold the order of the workplace, to respect the CEO's authority. On the other was a sense of moral responsibility, the quiet voice inside him that urged him to do the right thing, to step forward and offer support when it was needed. His eyes flickered back to the woman who had spoken out, who had dared to call attention to the injustice, to challenge the treatment she had been subjected to. She wasn't just standing up for herself, she was standing up for all the women who had been overlooked, dismissed, and silenced in this very room. The thought of the years of unspoken tension, of voices drowned out by those with power, gnawed at him. He wanted to help her, to step in and support her bold assertion. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just one person's discomfort. This was a battle of power, a confrontation that could have far-reaching consequences. The CEO's icy gaze met his for a brief moment, and Peter felt the weight of her stare like a tangible force pressing down on him. It was a look he had seen countless times before, one that commanded loyalty, that demanded submission. But in that moment, it didn't have the same effect. He wasn't afraid of her. Not anymore. He knew her power was built on fear, on controlling the room with intimidation and authority. But he also knew that real power, true leadership, came from respect and understanding, not fear. The woman before him had shown that in spades. His fingers twitched, an almost imperceptible movement, as if he was considering stepping forward to break the silence that had settled like a heavy fog over the room. His thoughts raced. What if he stepped in? What if he mediated? What if he told the CEO that this wasn't right, that her behavior was out of line? What if he could, with one simple gesture, shift the balance, side with the woman, and let the CEO see that her grip on control was not as strong as she thought? but a quiet voice of caution urged him to stay back. His job, after all, was to serve the company, and there was always the risk that stepping out of line would cost him his position, his livelihood. Yet, as he looked at the woman, standing firm, unwavering, despite the corporate power in front of her, he knew that this was a moment he couldn't ignore. His hesitation was short-lived. With a deep breath, Peter took a step forward. His body was still tense, his heart racing with a mix of fear and excitement. The room seemed to hold its breath as he moved closer, and for the first time, he felt as though he was truly choosing a side, not the side of the CEO, not the side of the company, but the side of what was right. "Excuse me, Miss Lawson," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of authority. The CEO turned to him, her eyebrows knitting together in surprise, but Peter didn't waver. "I think this needs to be addressed properly," he continued, his gaze flickering toward the woman, who looked at him with a mix of gratitude and determination. The CEO's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening, but Peter could see the shift in her demeanor. The power she had so easily wielded over him, over everyone else in the room, was slipping. For the first time, Peter realized, she was no longer in control of the narrative. The woman had already changed the dynamic, and now, Peter was choosing to stand with her. The tension in the room shifted once again, this time in her favor, as the audience waited for the next move. The ball was no longer in the CEO's court. The room was thick with tension as the CEO's finger remained pointed accusingly at her, his sharp gaze burning into her like a spotlight. For a brief moment, she felt her heart race, the weight of the situation pressing against her chest, but she took a deep, steadying breath and forced herself to meet his eyes. She knew this moment would come eventually, the inevitable confrontation over the contract that had set everything in motion. Her hands, though trembling slightly, were clenched at her sides as she gathered the courage to speak, to finally explain herself. The CEO's fury was almost tangible, his face flushed with indignation as he waited for her to stammer an apology, a justification, anything that might diffuse the anger he felt. But she wasn't going to apologize. This was not a mistake, not a misstep, and certainly not a misunderstanding. It was a decision, an intentional choice she had made after weeks of careful deliberation, and she owed him an explanation. Her voice, when it came, was calm but firm, unwavering in its clarity. "The contract wasn't a mistake," she began, each word measured, each syllable deliberate. The room seemed to hold its breath, the eyes of everyone in the room now locked onto her, waiting for the revelation that would either solidify or destroy the fragile peace between them. She could feel the CEO's glare, but it no longer intimidated her. This was her moment to stand her ground. "It was a choice," she continued, her tone steady despite the palpable tension. "I made a decision, knowing full well what the consequences could be. I knew it would be difficult, that there would be resistance, and that you'd be angry. But I made the choice because I believe it's the right one for both of us, and for the company." She paused, letting her words sink in. The CEO's face softened ever so slightly, but his eyes remained sharp, still burning with the heat of his initial anger. He was listening now, but the confusion in his gaze told her that he was struggling to understand, struggling to reconcile the woman standing before him with the actions she had taken. He had expected excuses, an attempt to downplay the severity of her decision, but she offered none. Instead, she presented her reasoning, clear and unflinching. "I know what you're thinking," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "That I overstepped, that I didn't consult you, that I acted without considering the full scope of the consequences. But I did think about it. I thought long and hard, and I weighed the risks against the potential rewards. You see, this isn't just about making the right decision for today, it's about positioning us for a future that's sustainable, a future where we don't just survive but thrive. And that requires bold decisions, decisions that may not always be popular in the moment, but ones that will prove to be the right ones in the long run. Her voice never wavered, and she could feel the power of her conviction slowly beginning to seep into the room. The CEO's posture shifted slightly, his jaw tightening as he processed her words, still clearly unsettled by her calm demeanor in the face of his wrath. He had expected defensiveness, fear, or even guilt, but all he found was an unwavering certainty in her eyes, something that both unnerved and intrigued him. His initial rage began to falter, replaced by a creeping curiosity, a desire to understand her, to understand the woman who had just made a decision that had so clearly shaken the foundations of their business relationship. The tension that had once been unbearable began to shift, the sharpness of the room's atmosphere now edged with something else, something softer, more complex. "So, you intentionally chose to go behind my back," the CEO finally said, his voice low, a mix of disbelief and guarded suspicion. She nodded, though the words didn't carry the weight of apology. She had acted with intention, and in this moment, she wasn't backing down. "Yes, I did. But not out of malice or disregard for you," she said, her gaze steady and unwavering. "I did it because I believed it was the only way to make sure the company could keep moving forward, could keep growing. Sometimes, the right decision isn't the easy one, and sometimes, it isn't the one that makes the people in charge happy. But it's the one that ensures survival." The CEO's lips pressed into a thin line, his anger dissipating but not entirely gone. He couldn't quite figure out how to feel her words were logical, and he could see the method behind her actions, but the sense of betrayal still lingered in the back of his mind, like a bitter aftertaste. He had always been in control, always been the one making the decisions, and now, here was this woman, standing in front of him, challenging his authority in the most direct way possible. And yet, for the first time, he wasn't angry, he was conflicted. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, hear the conviction in her voice, and it made him question his initial reaction. Was she right? Had she really done the right thing, even if it wasn't the thing he wanted? The silence in the room stretched on, each second heavy with the weight of their unspoken thoughts. Her confession had not defused the situation entirely, but it had shifted it, leaving a crack in his armor where curiosity had once been a distant, unemotional observer. He wasn't sure where this conversation would lead, but for the first time since it had all started, he was no longer just angry, he was listening, and something about her strength, her clarity, made him realize that perhaps the choice she had made wasn't as reckless as it had seemed at first. Slowly, the edges of his anger began to blur, replaced by a complex mix of emotions, confusion, curiosity, and a begrudging respect for the woman who had dared to stand her ground. The room was thick with tension, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone inside it. The CEO stood at the head of the conference table, his face flushed with disbelief, his jaw clenched tightly as the words he had just heard reverberated in his mind, refusing to fade. It couldn't be true. It simply couldn't. His thoughts raced as his eyes darted between the woman who had just made the boldest move of her career and the quiet, expectant faces of his employees who sat frozen, waiting for his reaction. He had always prided himself on his control, his ability to steer the ship through even the roughest waters, but this was something he never could have anticipated. The woman, someone he had trusted, someone who had been loyal for years, had defied him, publicly exposing a decision he had made in private. His first instinct was to reject it, to deny the reality of what was happening before him. His mind screamed that there had to be some mistake, that surely there had been a misunderstanding. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. His anger flared suddenly, like a fire igniting from within him, hot and unforgiving. How dare she? How dare she undermine his authority like this, in front of the whole company, in front of everyone who relied on him to lead them? His heart raced, and the room seemed to shrink around him as he struggled to maintain control. The words he had been holding back now exploded from his mouth, his voice harsh and tinged with the frustration of someone who felt betrayed. "What were you thinking?" he demanded, his hands gripping the edge of the table as though it might help him stay grounded in the face of the storm of emotions tearing through him. "This is not how we do things. You have no idea what you've just done." His anger surged again, the heat of it clouding his judgment, making him lash out without thinking. He couldn't understand why she would make such a bold move, why she would expose a decision he thought was sound, a decision he believed was necessary. Why would she do this to him, to the company, to everything they had worked for? His mind screamed for an explanation, but all he could do was feel the sting of her actions. There was a deep sense of betrayal gnawing at him, something he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge until now. In his mind, he had been the one who made the tough calls, the one who carried the weight of the business on his shoulders. He had built this company, had shaped its destiny with his own hands, and now, in one swift move, this woman had shaken the foundation of everything he thought he knew. The other employees sat in stunned silence, their eyes flickering nervously between the CEO and the woman who had just dared to challenge him. Some were looking for signs that the situation might de-escalate, others watching, almost with bated breath, to see what would happen next. Everyone knew the stakes. This was more than just a disagreement, this was a test of power, a clash of wills, and it could change everything. The CEO's emotions felt like a wave crashing against him, each one more forceful than the last. His pride was bruised, and he couldn't seem to stop the torrent of frustration that surged within him. His first instinct was to protect himself, to assert his dominance, but he knew on some deeper level that this was more than just a matter of control. It was something more personal, something that had to do with his own fear of losing control, of losing his place in the company, of being seen as weak. The foundation of his identity had always been his authority, his ability to make the hard decisions, to lead without question. To have someone challenge that, especially someone he considered an ally, felt like a personal affront, a direct attack on everything he had built. His anger clouded his judgment, and he couldn't quite see the full picture, not yet. But as he looked at the woman standing before him, unwavering and calm despite the storm he was stirring, a small seed of doubt began to sprout. How had it come to this? Was there something he had missed? Was he really the one in the right, or had his need for control blinded him to the deeper truths of the situation? His thoughts churned with confusion, and the anger that had initially felt like power began to feel hollow, as though it were slipping through his fingers, leaving him with nothing but a growing sense of unease. He was no longer the confident leader he had always been. Now, he was just a man grappling with a sudden loss of certainty, and that loss felt heavier than any criticism or rebellion could ever be. His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, he saw the woman not just as a subordinate, but as someone with her own strength, her own sense of purpose. She had made her move, and despite the anger that still bubbled in his chest, he couldn't help but respect the boldness with which she had done it. He still couldn't understand why she had chosen this path, but one thing was becoming painfully clear: this was a moment of reckoning, one that would force him to face more than just her challenge. It would force him to face his own insecurities and the things he had been too afraid to confront. And so, The room held its breath, the moment hanging in the balance, as the CEO stood there, grappling with his emotions, his anger still raw but tempered by the realization that the situation was more complicated than he had ever imagined. David Harris, the CEO of a successful car dealership chain, had always prided himself on being a man of action, decisive, sharp, and focused on results. But as he sat across from Clara Mitchell in the sleek conference room, his usual confidence wavered. Clara was nothing like the corporate clients he was accustomed to. She wasn't flashing a smile to butter him up or scrambling for his approval. She was quiet, composed, and spoke with the kind of quiet confidence that made him uneasy. As they discussed the terms of the new contract, the deal he had been pushing for, a lucrative agreement that would benefit his dealership but demand a lot from Clara's small family-owned company, David had expected her to fold, to negotiate weakly, or at the very least, show some sign of desperation. Instead, Clara stood her ground, her eyes steady, her voice calm, never wavering. Every time David pressed for more, asking for concessions that would allow him to maximize profits, Clara met him with logic, with data, and with an unwavering belief in the value of her business. She wasn't intimidated by his position, his power, or the weight of his company behind him. She wasn't backing down. It should have irritated him, this stubborn woman, this small business owner, challenging his authority, but instead, David found himself pausing, as if something inside him had clicked into place. Her poise, her ability to look him in the eye without fear, had a quiet strength that made him feel something he hadn't expected: respect. For a moment, he forgot about the numbers, the projected profits, and the terms of the deal. His mind drifted to something deeper, something that had been growing in the back of his mind for months, something he had tried to ignore. He had always been good at what he did, always focused on climbing higher, on expanding his empire. But in his single-minded pursuit of success, he had lost touch with something essential, the passion that had once driven him. He had become obsessed with deals, with margins, with winning, but somewhere along the way, he had forgotten what it felt like to take a stand for something beyond profit. As Clara's calm, yet firm, arguments continued, David realized that this contract wasn't just about money, it was about growth, both for her company and, surprisingly, for him. There was a challenge here, one he had been avoiding for years. Working with Clara would force him to rethink his approach, to question the narrow vision that had driven his success. She wasn't just offering a business deal, she was offering him a chance to rediscover a part of himself he had long abandoned. The weight of the realization hit him all at once. This was the challenge he needed to push himself, to push his company, to evolve beyond the stale formulas he had relied on. It wasn't about outsmarting the competition anymore or acquiring more dealerships, it was about learning to respect the value of others, understanding that true growth didn't always come from taking more, sometimes it came from giving more, from working with people who were driven by something beyond just profit. As the meeting continued, David's anger, which had been simmering ever since the negotiations started, slowly began to dissolve. He no longer saw Clara as a small player in the game, someone to be overpowered. Instead, he saw her as a reflection of everything he had lost in his relentless pursuit of success: authenticity, courage, and the willingness to stand firm for what she believed in. He realized that his irritation with her wasn't about the deal at all, it was about his own fear of change, his own reluctance to step outside the safe, predictable world he had created for himself. Clara wasn't just challenging him on the terms of a contract, she was challenging him to rethink his entire approach to business and life. And, for the first time in a long while, David felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years: excitement. It wasn't the kind of excitement that came from closing a big deal or making a profit. It was the kind that came from knowing that he was on the brink of something new, something that could help him grow as a person, as a leader, and as a businessman. Clara's unwavering confidence had opened his eyes. What had started as a battle for control had turned into a lesson in humility and a challenge for his own development. By the time the meeting ended, the deal was still in place, but something had shifted in David. He no longer viewed Clara as an obstacle to overcome, but as a partner, a peer, someone whose strength and clarity could help him grow beyond the confines of his own success. As he walked out of the conference room, he couldn't help but smile to himself, realizing that the greatest deal he had made that day wasn't in the contract. It was in the quiet, unspoken lesson he had learned about respect, courage, and the kind of growth that didn't come with numbers but with understanding. The room had been thick with tension, the air heavy with unspoken judgments and lingering discomfort. Just moments earlier, the CEO, Richard Dalton, had been ready to dismiss the woman, Maria, with the cold detachment that often came with his power. Her words had stung, a sharp and unexpected confrontation that had disrupted the careful balance of his authority. She had stood before him, her voice unwavering, calling him out on the very practices he had once regarded as a necessary evil, the very systems he believed kept his company running smoothly. But as the minutes stretched on, as her gaze remained steady, unflinching, something within Richard began to shift. At first, it was just a flicker, an inkling of discomfort, the kind that comes when long-held beliefs are challenged. But then, as Maria continued to speak with the quiet strength of someone who knew exactly what she was worth, he felt the weight of her honesty settle in. She wasn't asking for mercy or pleading for her job. No, Maria was asserting her value, her rights, and her vision, something Richard hadn't expected from someone in her position. What he had once perceived as a moment to assert his power quickly transformed into something far more complex. Maria wasn't merely confronting him, she was inviting him into a conversation he had been too afraid to have. She was showing him a different perspective, one that didn't fit neatly into his world of spreadsheets and quarterly reports. And for the first time in years, Richard found himself listening not as a CEO to an employee, but as a person to another person. The moments passed, and the walls he had built around his identity, his unwavering belief in his control, began to crumble. His mind raced, the realization dawning on him, he had been wrong. Not in the sense that Maria's critique was perfect or that he had been blind to every aspect of his business, but in the way he had failed to see the human element, the soul behind the decision-making. He had been so consumed with the numbers, with the big picture, that he had lost sight of the very thing that made his company thrive: the people. Maria wasn't just another employee, she was someone who had invested herself in the success of his business, in ways he had failed to appreciate. He had been ready to fire her, to push her out, but now, with the weight of the conversation settling on him, Richard realized the profound injustice of that thought. Maria's words had not just been a critique, they had been a wake-up call. She had reminded him of the values he had once stood for, the principles he had forgotten in the pursuit of profit. And now, standing in front of him, she had become something he had never expected: a mirror, reflecting the gaps in his own leadership, the areas where he had failed to lead with empathy and vision. The room, once filled with nervous energy and suspicion, now hummed with a new energy, a shared understanding. Richard's chest tightened, and with a deep breath, he looked directly at Maria, his voice measured but sincere. "I was wrong," he said, the words foreign on his tongue but freeing in their honesty. "I've been blind to the value you bring to this company. Your passion, your integrity, it's something I should have recognized long ago. Instead of punishing you, I should be thanking you for your honesty, for your courage to speak up. You've reminded me of something I've lost sight of." There was a pause, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Maria, who had braced herself for the worst, now stood in a space she hadn't anticipated, a space of acknowledgement, of respect. The tension between them dissolved, replaced by something entirely different. A mutual recognition of one another's humanity, of the shared understanding that their fates were not determined by power or hierarchy, but by the choices they made, the values they upheld. Richard's gaze softened as he continued, his admiration for Maria deepening with each passing moment. "I want to offer you more than just a job here. I want to offer you a partnership, a chance to work together to shape the future of this company, to create a business that values people as much as it does profit." Maria, taken aback by his words, felt her heart swell with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. She had entered this conversation expecting to lose everything: her job, her dignity, perhaps even her sense of self-worth. But in this moment, she felt more empowered than ever before. Richard, a man she had once regarded as untouchable, had become someone she could now speak to as an equal, someone who saw her not just as a cog in the machine, but as an essential part of the company's future. The room, which had once felt suffocating, now felt expansive with possibility. The very air seemed charged with a new energy, one of hope, of shared ambition. Richard wasn't the same man he had been when the conversation began. He was no longer a distant CEO holding all the power. He was someone who had been moved, challenged, and ultimately changed by the quiet strength of the woman before him. In that moment, Richard saw his business not as a machine to be fine-tuned for maximum profit, but as an organism, a living, breathing entity made up of people with voices, with vision, with the ability to shape something greater than themselves. And he knew that with Maria's help, with her insight and determination, they could build something lasting, something that truly mattered. As they shook hands, both aware of the weight of this new beginning, Richard felt a sense of renewal. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt a spark of excitement for what lay ahead. The future was no longer just about business, it was about people, and the promise of a shared vision. And in that shared vision, he knew they could create something extraordinary.